I read 20 horror books in 2024, and a few of them have stuck with me for months. Hello, I'm Taylor, and if you love staying up all night reading just to avoid the nightmares caused by the book you are reading, you are in the right place. To give you an idea of what kind of books are on this list, I am a big fan of haunted house stories, creature features, and campy slashers. I don't love super gross body horror. I read The Troop by Nick Cutter in 2023 and it still turns my stomach just thinking about it. So body horror in my top 10 is pretty mild. Here are my top 10 favorite horror books of 2024 and a few honorable mentions. Starting with the honorable mentions in no particular order, In the Eyes, in the Shadows by Gage Greenwood. If you have lost someone close to you, you probably know the horror of feeling stuck in grief while the rest of the world just speeds on past you. In the Eyes, in the Shadows by Gage Greenwood plays on the themes of grief and death in a way that is relatable but kicked up to level 100 beyond your worst nightmares. Upon his father's death, Jackson comes face to face with panic attacks he experienced as a teenager and is forced to dive deeper into the meaning behind it all. When he starts experiencing ghost activity and hallucinations, or are they actually hallucinations? Things in his life start to spiral out of control, and he has to navigate all of these big emotions while trying not to go absolutely nuts. I didn't read too much into the summary or teasers of this book before diving in because if it's written by Gage Greenwood, I'm gonna read it, and I loved going in with that blindfold on and just letting this story unfold. This book is scary and heartbreaking, and I loved every disgusting second of it. Have you ever wondered what happens to the final girl once the movie ends? The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix answers that exact question. This book follows a group of women who each survived a horrible massacre. If 80s style, slightly campy slasher movies are your thing, I think you'll like this book. Lynette and 5 other final girls have been meeting up for years for group therapy, but they're beginning to drift apart, and some of the women are wondering if they should even continue these sessions when one of them is murdered. All of them are horrified to find themselves thrown back into the nightmares from their pasts and don't know who to trust as they try to piece together who is targeting this group. This one was a binge read for me. I love Grady Hendrix's writing style, and this book does the mixed media thing where there are like newspaper clippings and different pieces of media from the world where the book takes place. I love that. I find it really fun and engaging. I really like this. The cover of this book says it is a gruesome, blood-soaked celebration of queerness, and this book follows through on that promise. The Only Safe Place Left is the Dark by Warren Wagner is a novella that follows a man named Quentin who is living alone in a cabin in the woods during a zombie apocalypse. Quentin is a gay man living with HIV and needs daily medication in order to survive. When his supply of meds starts to run low, he is put through a series of events that force him out of the safety of his cabin and into the terrifying world, or what's left of the world, around him. This is a traditional zombie apocalypse story with an interesting twist where the zombies are basically humans who are just not in control of their own bodies, but are fully aware of the horrors that they are being forced to commit by the virus running the show. Quentin is a character that is so lovable and you want to see him win. This book is gruesome and thought-provoking and heartbreaking. It is a super quick-paced, bite-sized horror story that I highly recommend. I want to read like 20 more of his books because I just loved it. Okay, let's get into the official top 10. If you are looking for a coming-of-middle-age story full of feminine rage with just the right amount of paranormal elements to help drive it home, Mary by Nat Cassidy might be the book for you. Our main character, Mary, is approaching her 50th birthday and is going through some changes that her doctor brushes off as perimenopause. But along with the hot flashes, Mary is also experiencing symptoms like seeing images of rotting flesh when she looks in the mirror and hearing voices that are urging her to commit unspeakable acts. You know, the usual. Unsatisfied with her current situation, she finds herself in a bit of a financial struggle. So when her Aunt Nadine needs her to move in to help with her medical issues, Mary finds herself thrown back into her childhood home where she begins remembering strange and spooky things that happened to her when she was a kid, along with seeing the ghosts of women who had been murdered in her hometown. All of this leads her down a path of self-discovery beyond her wildest nightmare. This book does a great job of telling a fictional story sprinkled with the real-life horrors women face in a world that favors youth and beauty above all. I loved this book. If you're not afraid of dolls already, you will be after this book. How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix will give you the creeps, make you laugh, and take you on a journey of the difficult of a love-hate sibling relationship. I'm an only child, but I can imagine this is a very relatable thing for a lot of people. Louise and Mark are siblings who have drifted apart and have made a lot of judgments about the other without really knowing each other's full story. But that will all change when they have to go back to their childhood home after their parents suddenly pass away. It would be overwhelming for anyone to take on the task of cleaning out their parents' house, but Louise finds an added layer of stress because her mom was a puppeteer, which means the house is bursting with all kinds of little puppets and dolls and taxidermy that seem to be staring at her and judging her with their beady little eyes. Yikes. She starts to feel like she's losing it when the dolls seem to be moving around, making noises, breaking things, etc. Louise is then forced to team up with Mark to take on the terrors of the house, and they find that there is even more to the situation than they could have ever imagined. Loved it. It's so upsetting. It's so good. Number 8 is Cackle by Rachel Harrison. This book was one that I felt like I wanted to read all at once, but I also wanted to read slowly because I never wanted it to end. Cackle by Rachel Harrison is the perfect balance of fantasy with a light touch of horror and lots of girl power and feminine rage and magic. I loved it. After going through a rough breakup, Annie moves into a new apartment in a tiny town, and we follow her journey of heartbreak in a way that a lot of us can relate to. She can't stop overanalyzing everything she did wrong, and she's having a really hard time getting over her ex. One day she meets a woman named Sophie, who is a magnetic powerhouse who seems to have the other people in town shaking in their boots. Is Sophie as scary as everyone seems to think? Annie doesn't think so. She's thrilled with her newfound friendship with this interesting woman who shows her there is more to life than she could have ever imagined. If you've been through a big transition in your adult life, I feel like you'll really relate to this story. It's like a coming of age, but for your 30s. Absolutely beautiful. Number 7, The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher. T. Kingfisher does a really fabulous job at taking you on a fever dream ride that you can't put down until it's done. The Twisted Ones is yet another reminder why you never go wandering into the forest, and you never make eye contact with something that may or may not be following you through said forest. Our main character, Mouse, is a 30-something-year-old woman who has agreed to take on the job of cleaning out her late grandmother's house. It's worse than she could have ever imagined, packed with hundreds of newspapers and books and all kinds of random crap, including a room full of dolls. Armed with garbage bags and her trusty dog, Bongo, she sets to work on the task of cleaning out the house. As she does, she finds her grandpa's journal where he wrote a bunch of really weird stuff, including this constant mention of the Twisted Ones. Mouse can't help but become obsessed with the situation, and the deeper she digs, the weirder things get around the house. One day when she takes Bongo for a walk, she follows him into what seems to be another world, where she sees these statues that she thinks her grandfather was talking about, the Twisted Ones. This book is a folk horror fever dream that will have you laughing, crying, and stressed. T. Kingfisher writes really relatable and realistic characters that are flawed and wonderful, and this book is just fantastic. Number 6 is The Spite House by Johnny Compton. It is always bananas when an author's first book just knocks it so far out of the park. The Spite House is Johnny Compton's debut novel, and it is absolutely phenomenal. This story follows Eric Ross and his daughters as they move into a house so that he can be somewhat of a caretaker, but there's kind of a weird twist. The owner of the Spite House is looking for someone to move into this house to prove that it is haunted. Eric thinks that this will be easy money and is like, okay, I'll just pretend we have experiences and evidence and do my job and make a big chunk of change, easy peasy. He and his daughters move in, and very quickly things fly off the handle. There is so much more to this house than Eric could have ever imagined. As it turns out, this twist of fate might be able to lead him to some answers about bizarre things that happened in his own family throughout the years. This is a gothic thriller ghost story following a father willing to do anything for his daughters. It is eerie at moments and sometimes heartwarming. It is absolutely wonderful. I can't wait to see what else Johnny Compton has up his very spooky sleeves. Number 5 is Fantasticland by Mike Bockoven. I listened to this as an audiobook, and I'm so glad I made this choice for this novel because it plays out perfectly. Fantasticland by Mike Bockoven is the perfect audiobook setup because it's set up like a podcast following events that took place during a hurricane that hit an amusement park. There are different interviews that follow different characters, so listening to it really helps to sell the whole story. Fantasticland in Florida has been around since the 70s where, quote-unquote, fun is guaranteed. This all falls to pieces when a group of employees and park guests get stuck with no power, no cell phone service, and no sign of help when a major hurricane hits. This story shows how quickly humans lose their minds and start to fight for themselves during a tragedy. There are tribes formed as these groups begin to fight for food, medical supplies, and shelter. The description on Goodreads says, quote, Fantasticland is a modern take on Lord of the Flies meets Battle Royale that probes the consequences of a social civilization built online, end quote. This is one of those books that I wish I could go back and experience again for the first time, so if you've never read it or listened to it, I highly recommend. Number 4, On a Clear Day, You Can See Block Island by Gage Greenwood. Gage Greenwood's books take readers on a wild ride every time, and On a Clear Day, You Can See Block Island is a very unique creature feature that follows the Keating family a few years after a horrible tragedy happens. The family is rocked by the whole ordeal, and each finds a different and sometimes self-destructive way to cope. This causes them to grow apart until they are all forced back together to deal with the truth of the situation. They quickly discover that there are actually monsters following them around, both mental and real. Gage Greenwood does a really beautiful job at showing grief, PTSD, and tough family relationships within a terrifying atmosphere that won't leave your mind for a while. Number 3, The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. I literally wept when I finished this book. The The Reformatory by Tananarive Due is a ghost story unlike any I have ever read. We follow a young boy named Robbie who is sent to a reformatory school for boys after he defends his older sister when one of the kids from the richest, whitest families in town tries to attack her. He is then given a ridiculous sentence, and the other kid gets off scot-free. Surprise, surprise. At this reformatory, the boys are treated terribly and the conditions are awful. This novel touches on the very real terrors faced by Black families living in 1950s Jim Crow Florida and uses ghostly elements to really help to drive the story home. Robbie discovers that he is able to see ghosts of some of the boys who have died at the reformatory, and they end up helping him learn the truth about what's really been happening in this hellhole. This book is gripping and heartbreaking and infuriating and so important. It is one of the best books I have ever read. Number 2, My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. Grady Hendrix has quickly become one of my favorite horror authors, obviously, since I've mentioned his books 3 times now in this top 10 list. He does a phenomenal job of writing female characters in a way that feels very real and authentic and relatable, and you connect with them so much. My Best Friend's Exorcism is my favorite book of his so far. He manages to tell a hilariously terrifying coming-of-age story about a group of girls who go through a terrifying ordeal. Gretchen and Abby became best friends when they were little girls, and they were always super close. As they enter high school, they start going through some bumps, like most friendships do as you get older, and you get different interests, and one of you is maybe possessed by a demon. This book is campy and spooky and packed with the most wonderful 80s references. This is a wild ride, and I absolutely loved it. Also, I'm going to tell you right now, don't watch the movie, it will ruin it. The movie doesn't even get close to the level of wonderful that this book is. And then number 1 is Sister, Maiden, Monster by Lucy A. Snyder. This book is weird and terrifying, and I think about it all the time. This is my absolute favorite book that I read in 2024. Sister, Maiden, Monster by Lucy Snyder is a cosmic horror with apocalyptic vibes. After a virus leaves the planet a total wreck, a small group of women are drawn together and put through a monstrous, creepy hellscape. This book has a little bit of everything. We are talking body horror that will make your skin crawl, relatable, heartbreaking characters, disgusting monsters, and also a couple of little spicy scenes to take the edge off. Whenever I talk about this book, I'm like, this one is for the weirdos. This is not your run-of-the-mill horror story. It pushes boundaries and is so unique. Check your trigger warnings and then buckle up for this wonderfully bizarre ride. I would love to know your favorite horror books in 2024 or just your favorite horror books in general, and what are you currently reading